Well, since I'm on a British invasion roll, how about some Who? And no, I'm not doing the Abbott and Costello bit this time. You thought the Rolling Stones were bad? They had to be censored on Ed Sullivan? They wouldn't even let the Who on their show. I mean, what do they think would happen? They'd blow up the stage? Oh. I've always loved the Who. They've been a huge influence on my writing and production, and for good reason. The way they evolved from being just another British invasion band with more of an edge like the Kinks, into creating these theatrical conceptions is quite extraordinary. Pete Townshend's writing was so vastly different, and he came up with seemingly esoteric concepts that just seemed to capture a philosophy of the time. In addition, you got Roger Daltrey's soulful voice, John Entwistle, who practically invented heavy rock bass playing, and Keith Moon. Oh, he's a video subject unto himself. Which is why this playlist will only consist of songs made while he was alive. Not that I dislike some of their later stuff, Eminence Front, it's just that I really want to focus on the original lineup. Same rules as before, the playlist will be personalized, it's going to be formatted like a vinyl record, 26 minutes a side. Let's hit it. We start right at the beginning with their first hit single, I Can't Explain. Great tune, very heavily influenced by the Kinks, specifically All Day and All the Night. A great place to start. Catchy melody, well sung by Roger. Already you can hear some of Mooney's crazy fills, and there's plenty of room to grow. Supposedly Jimmy Page played on the session, but it's a bit unclear if his contributions made it to the final product. Either way, there's some great 12-string licks throughout this tune. They'd continue to play it live, and it always sounded fresh. But a couple singles later is when a classic emerged, My Generation. I'm not sure if this is now considered offensive with Roger mimicking the stutter. I know the BBC was reluctant to play it back then because of that, but I think the idea is more to mimic a drugged out teenager rather than ridicule a speech impediment. It really is a rebellious teenage anthem, a precursor to punk in many ways. The bluesy call and response is so irresistible. The famous bass solo John Entwistle played is one of the reasons I got so interested in bass playing. And apparently John bought a Dan Electro bass for a more trebly sound, but broke all the strings during the session. He bought a new Dan Electro since they didn't sell the strings separately, broke all of those strings, and had to buy another Dan Electro. Fortunately, the end results speak for themselves, and the ending is just pure Who, with Pete experimenting with feedback and Mooney just beating those drums like his life depends on it. Now let's skip forward to 1967 with the single I Can See for Miles from the Who's Sell Out. It's a really heavy tune about a jealous man with magic eyes stalking his cheating lover. Some really good flowing narrative here, well performed by Roger, and those harmonies are so inventive. This is really where the Who's distinctive three-part harmony sound was being used to its full potential. And apparently this song inspired Paul McCartney to write Helter Skelter, when I Can See for Miles was lauded as the heaviest song ever produced. I don't know if I would have referred to the song as such back then, but it's a classic nonetheless. Okay, so we're gonna get into Tommy now, the Who's groundbreaking rock opera, and arguably the best known song, and for good reason, is Pinball Wizard. That opening banjo-style guitar riff is iconic. And I just want to take a minute here to mention that I really consider Pete Townshend to be one of the best rhythm guitarists in rock history. His strumming patterns, especially on this song, are out of this world. Pinball Wizard kind of tells the whole story in one song. A deaf, dumb, and blind kid who can sense the vibrations of the pinball machine and beats the local pinball champ. And yes, it's impossible for me not to imagine Elton John in his giant platform shoes in this song. I like the way they use everyone's voices here. The way Pete comes in with that vocal in a very conversational way, it's very inventive. And the modulation from B to D at the end is just the icing on the cake. I've got to say though, my favorite renditions of a lot of these songs are not from the album itself, but from the Who's legendary Woodstock performance, which fortunately is captured on the Kids Are Alright soundtrack. This includes an emotionally raw version of See Me Feel Me, which is the closing section of We're Not Gonna Take It from the album. It's not necessarily a very clean recording, and the performance is a little rough around the edges, but the emotion in Roger's voice as he sings those famous lines is unmatched. This is arguably Roger's greatest vocal and one of the best in rock history. No wonder they used it in the Woodstock film. Once it melds into the Listening to You section, the dynamics just grow and grow, with Pete playing some fantastic lead guitar lines, all held together by John's bass, which sounds like it's about to explode. Another example of finely crafted harmonies, a little splash of Go to the Mirror to close out the tune, and you've got yourself a classic live rendition of a masterpiece. And as long as we're on the live thing, let's talk live at Leeds. I can include so many tunes from this record, many of which are covers. But as I like to stick to originals on these lists, let's go with the definitive version of Magic Bus. 7 minutes long, but it definitely doesn't feel its length. It's a super cool bluesy opening, the crowd adding to the atmosphere before Roger comes in with the melody. It's kind of similar to My Generation with that call and response idea, except it's much sillier as the protagonist wants to buy the Magic Bus. It gets even funnier live when Pete takes the role of the driver and they have sort of a Monty Python style haggle going on as the song's playing. And then Pete's pick runs down his guitar strings, Keith comes in with a fiery fill, and we're joined by Roger's harmonica solo. By the way, one of my favorite moments in any Who documentary is when Pete calls Magic Bus one of his favorite songs to play, only to cut to John Entwistle who says he hates playing it, mostly because it's 7 minutes of A.
There are certain recordings where it actually sounds like I fall asleep.
Well, that's pretty much the 60s wrapped up in side 1. Now let's dive into side 2 with their 1970 single, The Seeker. Pretty simple bluesy kind of song. More solid rhythm guitar playing from Pete with a melodic bass line complementing it. What is he seeking? It's up to interpretation, but I've always assumed it to be some kind of consciousness, especially since Pete was getting into Mayor Baba at the time. And speaking of Mayor Baba, that'll lead us perfectly into the first song off of Who's Next? Baba O'Reilly. No, it's not called Teenage Wasteland. And according to Pete, it's not really a pro-drug song.
It's not about getting wasted, it's about waste.
Rather, it's a critical look at the wasteland of teenagers stoned on acid, especially the waste that they would leave behind following festivals like Woodstock or Isle of Wight. This was to be the overture for their aborted Lifehouse project. The follow-up to Tommy, though a bit more esoteric and sort of a science fiction communal concert experience. It's kind of like the Who's version of the Beach Boys' Smile album, except the material to immediately emerge from the project became their best-loved work. That opening synth, which is actually an affected organ, was very influential in the development of keyboard sounds throughout the 70s. I love the way they use Roger and Pete's voices. Pete especially is probably best remembered for singing the chorus line during the breakdown. And also credit Dave Arbus for the violin solo at the end. This may very well be my favorite Who song, certainly one I spun over and over and over again. I even used it as my ringtone for a while. But there are so many songs off of Who's Next that could go on this list. And I feel like I'm committing heresy by not including Won't Get Fooled Again. It's a pretty long song, but don't worry, we'll get to it in the bonus tracks. What I can't leave out is Behind Blue Eyes. Their most loved ballad, and one of their most loved songs, period. Roger in particular really delivers a stirring vocal performance. It just grows in intensity as he conveys this suppressed anger. Pete has said the song's more about the suppression of love, but I like the way Roger interprets it. You can tell it's a very personal song for him. And those harmonies, straight up Beatles-esque while being their own thing. This is probably exactly what people think of when the Who's harmony sound comes to mind. Roger, Pete, John, they're just so perfectly matched, and the layers of vocal tracks are extraordinary. And that's just one part of it. Once Keith Moon comes in, the song takes a whole new life, like the suppressed anger has just exploded, and Roger desperately pleading with his lover to unclench his fist. This is genius writing and execution. And once the chorus comes in for one last hit, I mean, it's a masterpiece, plain and simple. But as much as I love Who's Next, I think Quadrophenia might be my favorite album of theirs. This is like Tommy fully realized, with a more grounded story about a schizophrenic or a quadrophenic mod just trying to deal with this ailment and find his place in a violent world of mods versus rockers. And after a unique soundscape introduction, which was very influential on me when I did the Elements piece, the real me just bursts the album open in fine style. And the man who's really leading the charge here is John Entwistle, with those bass runs that might as well be lead guitar lines. They work so perfectly against Mooney's energetic drumming, with Pete holding it all down. That's also John playing those horn arrangements, and I think this entire album is some of Roger's best vocals. He kills this song with his raucous voice. I think this is a universal feeling, going to see a doctor or a preacher, talking to your parents about what's wrong with you, and a firm look at how schizophrenia affects our ability to just live a normal life. But musically, it goes back to the blues, speaking about your ailments while the upbeat music is like a form of therapy in itself. I'll come back to Quadrophenia in a minute. I thought I should include at least one John Entwistle song on this list. I can include My Wife, Boris the Spider, but just to get the Who by numbers in there, let's include Success Story. The lead vocal is partially sung by John, with Roger on the verses. John's also playing 8-string bass guitar for this. It's like a 12-string for bass. Like a lot of John's tunes, it's more of a comedic song. I used to think the rock and roll singer turned preacher on TV was about Little Richard, but supposedly it's a jab at Pete for bringing spirituality into the band's repertoire. It's not my favorite Who song, but it's just a funny number and a good inclusion to break up the more philosophical tracks. Also, there's an absolutely hilarious moment in the Kids Are Alright movie where John just starts shooting gold records for no reason whatsoever while this song plays. Maybe it's a comment on rock and roll excess, but I can't listen to the song without thinking about it. But let's get serious again for our last song. Back to Quadrophenia for the closing track, Love Reign Over Me. The idea of the song comes again from the teaching of Mayor Baba, who said rain is a blessing from God. And in terms of the story, it's sort of a moment of clarity for the protagonist. Of course, Roger once again interpreted it in his own way, and I think this is actually Roger's finest studio vocal. The emotion, the anger, the screams, some of which I think are even more impressive than Won't Get Fooled Again. It's just an amazing rock and roll vocal. Pete plays piano throughout the opening, layered with synths to sound like a string section, John's horns, and some really effective lead guitar lines. And again, you got John's bass, Mooney's heavy drum fills, Pete's string scrapes. Even in one of their most heart-wrenching ballads, it's got that classic Who sound. So there we have it, another compilation from The Who. Now let's move on to 6 bonus tracks. Let's go back to their early singles and include Substitute, a great British invasion pop rock song with another neat bass solo from John, even though I have no idea what it's about. I guess it's more of a mod thing. Generally speaking, I try to stick with original material on these compilations, but I'm definitely going to make an exception with Young Man Blues from Live at Leeds. A Mose Allison song, but one the band makes all their own. It rocks so hard. The main riff, the stops with Mooney's spastic fills, Roger's hard edge a cappella vocals, and a jam that rivals even Cream's best work. This whole album includes some of Pete's best guitar solos, and this one is no exception. And now we can get back to Who's Next, and I really want to include Bargain. I've just always loved this song. Another great use of Roger and Pete's voices singing different sections of the song. Pete's bridge in particular is very emotional, with some wonderful 12-string acoustic guitar playing. The synths are also a nice texture here. Another favorite of mine. An unused track from the Lifehouse concept and Who's Next was Joined Together, a 1972 single, and this really feels like it captures the communal concert idea of Lifehouse. It's just another solid tune, great harmonies, nice picking from Pete, and a great lead vocal from Roger. What about Quadrophenia? Anything else from that? Hell yeah, let's talk about Bellboy, another epic tune. The storyline is very interesting, as the protagonist sees a badass mod he used to look up to, now working a mundane job, a bellboy. And while Roger sings another memorable lead vocal, it's best known for featuring Keith Moon as the second lead vocalist. Keith sang a couple songs here and there in this sort of character-like voice. He's clearly not as strong a singer as the other 3 members of the band, but he makes up for it in charisma. It's also fun to watch live versions of this where he'd stop playing drums and take Roger's microphone. I know what some of you are probably thinking, where's that song? Well, I saved it for last because even though these are the bonus tracks, it's still technically the end of the playlist, and really, what can possibly come after Won't Get Fooled Again? We don't get fooled again! I've talked about this song at length in the History of Rock's 70s documentary. It's iconic. It's one of the best-loved rock and roll songs of all time. That scream Roger belts out is legendary, but just everything comes together. That driving synth pattern, John Entwistle's melodic bass lines, Keith Moon's rock star drum fills, and Pete Townshend's memorable guitar riffs. I mean, you hear them and you just want to windmill. You just want to windmill every time you hear them. Sorry, I'm getting a little excited. Even if it was intended for the Lifehouse project, it's definitely a product of the 60s anti-war movement. But the political implications of the song are a bit more blurred. The famous line, "Meet the new boss, same as the old boss," very Orwellian. And in a fitting ending, they do these symphonic kind of half-note stops before one long crash on the A. Even as I'm sitting here, I'm regretting not including Won't Get Fooled Again in the main playlist, but we'd have to sacrifice 2 songs because of it. Really just goes to show you how much great material The Who really have. So, that's my playlist. There's a link in the description. And as always, what are your favorite Who songs? What would be on your playlist? Comment below. And let me know what you would like me to talk about next. You know what? I did the Who's Next joke in the last video. I'm not doing it again. Anyway, take care all. I'll see you soon.